Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Donna Martinez. Welcome once again to another edition of Shaftesbury Society, coming to you live from the headquarters of the John Locke Foundation in Midtown Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope your week is off to a good start. We've got a very interesting conversation for you over the next hour. It's all about energy in North Carolina. And of course, we must have it. We use it every single day. The big question is, how are we going to move forward to make sure that it is the lowest cost possible for those of us who are paying the bills, and that we're paying attention to exactly what our energy sources are and making those policy decisions that are important going forward? Well, we know that our governor, Roy Cooper's Clean Energy Plan, calls for a 70% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from electricity by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. So how would we get there? Well, estimates from Duke Energy for implementing that plan, along with some future grid modeling, is showing that our governor's plan is expensive, it's wasteful, and it's also risky. In our conversation today, we're going to be looking at Governor Cooper's plan for energy going forward, and also the findings of a Locke Commission study that really focuses on how we actually get there in a more efficient way. And it's very interesting. I know you're going to be very intrigued by what we're talking about here today. Joining us on our panel, my colleague here at the John Locke Foundation, John Sanders. He is Research Editor and Senior Fellow of Regulatory Studies. And if you follow John's work, and I'm sure many of you do, you know that he writes about energy issues a lot at johnlocke.org. Also joining us is Isaac Orr. Isaac is Policy Fellow with the Center of the American Experiment, and American Experiment actually provided some of the modeling for this Locke Commission study that we're going to go over today. And then also the author of this study, Jordan McGillis. He is Deputy Director of Policy for the Institute for Energy Research. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Appreciate y'all being here.
Thanks, Donna.
Thanks for having us.
Isaac, I'd like to start with you. Give us your perspective, if you would, of where we stand in terms of the energy landscape and moving forward.
Yeah, that's a great question to talk about. So right now we are in a paradigm. We're abandoning our reliable power plants, essentially the things that have been good for us for the last 100 years, right? So our dispatchable, reliable coal, nuclear, and natural gas power plants. And we're moving towards unreliable energy systems like wind and solar. So really, I think we're rolling the dice with our energy system moving forward, and that's unfortunate.
John, I know that you write about this issue frequently, and you're very much focused on not only what the requirements here in North Carolina are for so-called renewable sources, but your emphasis on making sure that the reliability that Isaac mentioned is there, and that the lowest cost possible sources are being used.
Yeah, and these are very important issues, and these are issues that are recognized within state law. But North Carolina recognized years ago, they considered that electricity policy, that provision of electricity was something done by what they call a natural monopoly, which is the belief that nobody else could do it. So this was going to be something they needed to protect consumers from monopoly pricing. So North Carolina law basically puts it that the availability of adequate and reliable supply of electric power is critically important to the people, to the economy, to the government of North Carolina. And so the law puts it that the rate, services, and operations of the utilities are all affected with the public interest. And so the state law standard is adequate, reliable, and economic utility service to all citizens and residents of the state, and the least cost mix of generation demand reduction measures. That's important because either we have no choice who is providing us electricity, and so the standard, and I agree with that standard, that it has to be least cost and reliable. You know, we can't expect to turn on the light and then get socked as a ratepayer and wonder if we're actually going to have any provision of power. So this mention of dispatchability is extremely important. The fossil fuels are what they call dispatchable, which means that if there's unexpected demand at any point in time, the electricity utilities can rely on a fossil fuel to produce electricity the minute that they need it. It can be dispatched. Even Governor Cooper knows that solar is non-dispatchable. As we've shown here at John Locke, the solar that he has on his own land, he got a letter from them saying that the maximum reliability that he could expect at any discrete moment in time is 0 megawatts. So, he can't rely on anything. And it's important because it's something that we all need. It's a basic human necessity. It's not a luxury item.
And that issue of reliability, we're going to be talking more about that because this is obviously not just some theoretical discussion here. And front and center examples, California and Texas. We all know what has happened in those states over the past several years related to their energy policy. And you've had people who have literally been in the dark. So exactly what do we do, and what would Governor Cooper's plan really mean to each and every North Carolinian? That's the focus of our newly produced Locke Commission study on Energy Crossroads. This is the report right here, and my colleague Brene is going to be posting in the comments section of our Facebook page a link to this report. This is really important work. It's valuable work, and it's got an excellent summary in it. If you don't have the inclination or the time to read all of the details, and it is quite detailed, it's got a great summary to explain to you what's going on here. The author is one of our guests, Jordan McGillis. Jordan, I'd like to turn the floor over to you to give us a summary of what's in your Energy Crossroads report.
All right, let's get into it. Thank you, Donna. And thank you to the entire John Locke Foundation, in particular, Amy Oliver Cook and Brian Balfour and Brooke Medina and Greg DeDoug, who helped me to put this into production and deliver that beautiful product that you just showed. I'm really happy that we were able to provide something physical and tangible that people in North Carolina and legislators in particular will be able to leaf through. I work for the Institute for Energy Research, which is a Washington-based 501c3, and we mostly focus on federal policy. I was really honored that I got the opportunity to dig in on a state level and really explore North Carolina. It's been a lot of fun, and I think we put together a great product, and we couldn't have done it without the amazing work from Isaac Orr and his colleagues at American Experiment, who performed the modeling, and we couldn't have done it without all the legwork that John Sanders has done over the years at the John Locke Foundation. So what I'm going to do here is walk through first the table of contents and give you just a big picture of what's in this report, what we cover. And then I'll go through the executive summary, which are the most important points. And then we'll finish with what I call the big ticket items. It'll be 3 things that I think everyone who listens to this, this webcast should take away from our conversation. So we start in this report by discussing the state of affairs, the status quo in North Carolina electricity. And frankly, as John said, it's a pretty good picture. If you are concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, North Carolina is one of the best states in the country at delivering both economic growth and reduction in emissions. It's been getting better year over year, and that's mainly a result of using more natural gas over time. So North Carolina is on a great footing there. And you can't come away from digging into it as I did without feeling optimistic at the trajectory the state's on, regardless of where you come down on these political questions. The current state of affairs is strong, and there's really no need to divert course, as I think John would agree. So as I said, the greenhouse gas emissions in North Carolina have been on the decline, and that's something that the advocates for the Clean Energy Plan don't seem to really respect. They want radical change, but we're on a steady course toward lower emissions and great economic productivity in this state. North Carolina also has rather positive electricity rates. It's low cost and it's reliable. So the state of affairs is solid in North Carolina. Electricity policy is where we have the challenges, and the Clean Energy Plan, which as you referenced has a goal of 70% emissions reductions, could present some real challenges. But what this report really gets into is whether there are good or bad ways to aim for the Clean Energy Plan targets. And that's what Isaac's team shows us, that there are some ways that are much better if we want to hit that 70% reduction. So looking at the Clean Energy Plan, there are good ways and bad ways we could go about it. The particular point of departure that we use for this report is not just the Clean Energy Plan, though. We're actually digging into are the integrated resource plans from Duke Energy. And this is a bit complicated, but the integrated resource plans are different approaches that Duke, which is, as John said, effectively an electricity monopoly, what it can do to aim for the clean energy plan targets. And Duke provides 6 different portfolios. The integrated resource plans are something they're required to produce for the state and for the state to assess, and then we make political decisions based on what they say is possible. There's one portfolio in particular that most reflects what the Clean Energy Plan calls for, and that's Portfolio D, a portfolio that is heavily reliant on the wind and solar that the Clean Energy Plan would like North Carolina to use. So what Isaac's team did was performed modeling to show the cost, to show the emissions reduction, and then to show us how much we would have to pay to get the emissions reduction from both the portfolio that we discussed, the wind and solar, and then some alternatives. And the alternatives that Isaac and his team analyzed include one plan that would increase natural gas utilization, one plan that would increase nuclear utilization based on US Energy Information Administration assumptions, and then a plan that would use it's a foreign reactor called the APR 1400. It was originated in Korea, and it's now being used in the United Arab Emirates as well. And so this analysis looks at wind and solar, it looks at natural gas, and then it has 2 nuclear scenarios that we evaluate, the EIA scenario and the APR 1400 scenario. And then we break down all the hidden costs of the Clean Energy Plan, and those range from environmental costs due to the extensive land use, to the environmental costs of digging up the mineral resources that are necessary for the batteries that would back up wind and solar. And it gets into the enormous transmission challenges that would come from having widely dispersed generation sources rather than the concentrated sources like natural gas and nuclear. And then we conclude with what we call the nuclear opportunity, and we talk about the chance North Carolina has to both hit its clean energy plan targets and provide reliable, affordable electricity for the state. So our executive summary, here are the points that we hit. There's about 10 of them. First point, the wind and solar plan would cost over $100 per metric ton of reduced carbon dioxide. If you compare that to the other opportunities we have, natural gas and nuclear, it's more than double the cost of the Korean nuclear plan. It's 33% more than the EIA nuclear plan. And the natural gas plan basically wouldn't cost us any additional money. It would essentially be just baseline costs. So $100 more per metric ton comparing the wind and solar plan to the natural gas plan. That's a no-brainer. Another focus here in the executive summary is that expanding nuclear would hit all of those numbers we want to hit with the clean energy plan and do it at the lower cost I mentioned. The natural gas approach would not get quite as low on its emissions reductions, but it would be a more than 50% reduction from the 2005 baseline that the state uses as its model year. So nuclear provides just as much in terms of emissions reduction at a significantly lower cost than does the wind and solar plan put forward by the Clean Energy Plan. Natural gas, very strong in terms of emissions reductions, more than 50% reduction is what the modeling shows, and it would also come at basically no additional cost. The other big focus is on land use, and I think I'll hold off on that and get to it in a moment. And let's move to the big ticket items. Big ticket items, the first thing, a bit of an elephant in the room that of course we need to cover, and we'll talk about this more in the Q&A, is the broader questions about climate change. Certainly there's a lot that remains unsettled in the field of climate science. The biggest thing I would point to, if people want to look into this, is equilibrium climate sensitivity. And that's a term we use to describe the effect of a doubling of greenhouse gas concentrations on temperature. How much change will we really see based on greenhouse gases? That's something that's very much unsettled. And there's also the climate economics, which are even more contentious than the climate science itself, I would say. But that's not what this paper is about. This paper looks at the Clean Energy Plan, and we want to make sure that we are heading this off because we're heading toward a potential energy crisis. if we follow this plan. We hear a lot about climate crisis, but politically we are inducing a crisis if we pursue the wind and solar plan that has been put forward by Duke Energy in accordance with the Clean Energy Plan. And that's what we're here to focus on, not the details of climate change. So the two big ticket items that are in this paper are, one, the most important concept you must understand when it comes to wind and solar power, and that's intermittency. Wind and solar are not dispatchable, as Isaac referred to. Dispatchable sources of electricity are sources that we can turn on and off as needed. Wind and solar do not have that capability. When the wind blows, wind electricity is generated. When the sun shines, we get solar power. And obviously those are variable. They change seasonally, they change on a diurnal basis. So as a result, you need to have massive duplication of infrastructure if you're going to rely on those sources, particularly in battery form. A related key concept to intermittency is the capacity factor. And Isaac's team provided some really good numbers on this. Capacity factor refers to how much of the nameplate capacity a particular power plant or source of energy in general gets. And the strongest performer by far is nuclear, which has a capacity factor in North Carolina of 94%, meaning the nameplate capacity, what's the maximum output you could get from this plant? 94% of that across the course of a year, that's what you're getting from nuclear. Wind and solar are on the complete other end of the spectrum. Wind's capacity factor is less than 35% across the country. We don't have a ton of wind in North Carolina yet to get great numbers on how it would look in that state. But from the Department of Energy, we know that wind generally performs at about a third of its nameplate capacity. Solar is even lower. And John mentioned the governor's own land and the expectations you could have for actual electricity production. It's abysmal. Solar's capacity factor is actually below 25% across the country. So if you want to get a stable electricity supply, wind and solar simply aren't going to do it. And for them to do it, we would need to have massive investment into storage, into batteries. That's where a lot of the cost from this plan arises. Related to the intermittency is reliability. Wind and solar can actually reduce the reliability of a grid at large. I live in California. You can see this virtual background of San Diego behind me. We have some serious problems with our reliability. And a significant aspect of that is too much penetration of wind and solar. Donna and I were chatting before this went live about the drive from Arizona to California. And for anyone who's done that, you know, you see solar panel after solar panel after solar panel, and you see windmills all over the mountains on the lee side. And sure, that generates some electricity, but that solar in particular is generating electricity when we don't need it. It's during the middle of the day when people are often out of their homes doing other things. When people get home in the evening, they need a little bit more air conditioning. They turn on lights, turn on the television. That's when demand climbs, and that's when solar leaves the grid. So having additional solar on the grid, and wind to a lesser degree, does not actually contribute to the reliability of a grid in general. So in addition to the cost of building all this new infrastructure and building all the batteries, you're actually creating problems for your grid if you have too much penetration of wind and solar. And then the second big point, first point's intermittency. We need to have that internalized so we can respond to proponents of this plan readily with that term of intermittency. The other huge issue I see with the clean energy plan and the wind and solar approach is land use. This is, I think, the most arresting section of the report. We've got costs, we've got geopolitical risk in this report, but those are abstract at times, whereas the land use, I can visualize. I know what 1 square mile of land looks like, and I know what 1,000 square miles of land looks like on a map. And that's truly the scale of difference we're talking about here between utilizing wind and solar and utilizing natural gas or nuclear to shore up North Carolina's energy future. A couple of the great numbers that Isaac's team provided. Powering North Carolina with natural gas, with this natural gas scenario in which we increase that utilization, would require about 13 square miles for electricity generation. Very small footprint. To power North Carolina with nuclear on the EIA assumptions would require about 5.5 square miles. So it's even more powerful in that respect than natural gas. And then if we use the Korean reactor assumptions, we could actually power North Carolina with just 4.5 square miles of land use. That's tremendous. Now, you might be thinking, okay, wind and solar, maybe it's 5 times as much, maybe it's 10 times as much. No, we're on a different order of magnitude. It would require 3,375 square miles to pursue this wind and solar plan to power North Carolina. Again, that's 13 miles square for natural gas, 5.5 on the EIA nuclear assumptions, 4.5 with the Korean assumptions, and over 3,000 square miles for wind and solar. So it is a completely different ballgame. And the cost there extends beyond the money. We're talking about degrading our natural environment, degrading the beautiful mountain landscapes we have in the western part of your state and the ocean views we have in the eastern part of your state. So again, these 2 big points I think every reader should focus on, or every viewer of this webcast, are the intermittency of wind and solar as compared to the dispatchability of natural gas and nuclear, and then the land use, which is on different orders of magnitude. So when we look at the big question this paper addresses, what is the best way to pursue these political goals if we are indeed committing to them? It's quite clear that there's an opportunity for North Carolina to expand on its strengths. And those strengths are robust nuclear electricity generation. It's been the state's mainstay for about 40 years. And then, building some natural gas on top of that, as we've been doing for the past 2 decades. That is clearly the cost-effective way if we're going to pursue this political goal. And I'm sure my co-panelists will have much more to say on that, but those are the big points: intermittency and the land use cost of the wind and solar plan.
Jordan, thank you very much for that. And folks, I want to remind you that the entire report is called Energy Crossroads. It is posted, a link to it, in the comment section on our Facebook page, or you can go to johnlocke.org and you will see it right there under the research tab, lower left of the home screen, johnlocke.org. I wanted also to point out 2 very interesting charts that are inside this report that you can access and look at for yourself that I think are really important to the conversation. One is, Jordan mentioned this, and this is the capacity factor by source. And I will show this to you right here. And you can see the vast differences in the capacity factor through these different sources, with nuclear here, 93.5, solar down here at 24.5. Also, if you're interested in the basics, North Carolina's electricity generation by source, there's a great pie chart here that will show you that as well inside this report. So I'd like to bring Isaac and John back into the conversation here. Very interesting. Isaac, Jordan said we're inducing a crisis if we follow Governor Cooper's clean energy plan focus on wind and solar. I mean, that's the last thing you want, whether you are on the left, the center, or the right, to induce a crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with Jordan. I use the same verbiage often in my own writing. And basically, what we have is a situation where people who are concerned about CO2 emissions are placing that as the most important priority in the energy system. And they're kind of forgetting about the basics, which is, we say in school, we say reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? But in the power generation sphere, is it reliable? Is it affordable? And then you want to use that third stool is how can we do this in the most environmentally sustainable way possible? But reliable and affordable need to come first. And that's just been forgotten. So we're essentially trading what they perceive to be a long-term crisis in terms of CO2 emissions for an immediate crisis of not having reliable energy sources. And what we've seen in Texas, in California, and people forget there was 14 other states that had power outages at the same time as Texas in the Southwest Power Pool, which is kind of the central plains of the country. So really, this is a huge problem, and the extent to which we decide to trade one crisis for another is really just a political decision. And that's really why, when I was speaking with Amy about, okay, what's the extent of the modeling going to be? We said we need to model this scenario that is the most like Governor Cooper's, because, the people of North Carolina deserve to have clear answers about what will this do to the reliability and affordability of our electric grid.
John, it's a really interesting point, trading one crisis for another. I think the phrase Isaac just used was the crisis of emissions. But John, you point out frequently in your writing that we really don't have a crisis of greenhouse gas emissions here in North Carolina. Things have been reducing rather rapidly here.
They have, and I think it's a shame that it's been so underreported. But just since 2000, and a lot of this has to do with the changeover from heavy reliance on coal to more reliance on natural gas and nuclear in the past two decades. But our carbon dioxide emissions are down over 40%. Our nitrogen oxides emissions are down close to 75%. Our sulfur dioxide emissions are down almost 93%. So the crisis that we have in our minds from people talking about it like Governor Cooper and from the general perception given to us in media, it's not exactly what it is. I mean, things are getting better and we're not hearing about that. But furthermore, going back to what Isaac said about reliability and affordability, with respect to the clean power plan, the clean energy plan from Governor Cooper, this was put together under what they call the stakeholder process. And it's the sort of thing I personally find obnoxious because the stakeholder never includes consumers. It never includes the people. So the stakeholders are all of these, mostly environmental groups. There's over 160 different environmental groups and community groups, which are all kind of have the same idea. And they were asked what was the most important thing. And for them, 20% of them listed environmental and concerns and carbon reduction. Only 7% of them mentioned affordability and reliability. So the plan that they put forward is geared toward not worrying about affordability and reliability. But this is a huge deal because these costs are something that everybody faces. And because of that, it's something that affects the poor most of all. It affects small business most of all. So these have significant economic costs for people, and those are major, and they need to be remembered.
John, that's a great point, that there's some misrepresentation going on in terms of what people really value. And I saw a Harvard-Harris poll that came out earlier this month. I think it was on July 1st. And what it found was that environment/climate change, that was their terminology, came in 10th among the various issues Americans are concerned about. It was below just about any other topic you could think of.
Yeah,
And that's how it always goes, right? Any polling from, I mean, you can look back 10 years, like climate change rarely polls above 10th place. So this is very common. So people understand that when they're like, if they're asked in a vacuum, do you care about this issue? They say, oh yeah, of course I do.
Exactly.
But when they're asked to prioritize it among other things that they also care about, it falls down the list of priorities. So unfortunately, that's not how the people who are pushing the clean energy plan feel about this. They think this is the only priority, and that's why they're pushing a plan that is so expensive and also unreliable.
Exactly. People are apt to say, gee, I suppose I am concerned about climate change when they're asked specifically about it. But when you put it in the context of wider social life and family life, it comes far below the kitchen table issues and the economic issues that people are thinking about on a day-to-day basis, as I think it should.
Gentlemen, I think it's interesting that when we talk about environmentalists and environmentalism, that we tend to think folks who are left of center, yet there are many conservatives, I mean, I'm one, that I'm very concerned about the environment. I don't want to do anything that unnecessarily degrades the environment, and I think there are ways to go about that to let the market system work, but still protect the environment. And Jordan, listening to everything you've talked about, it seems to me that environmentalists should be reading your report, whether they're on left, center, or right, and saying, hey, this land use issue is a huge deal. It would degrade the environment, and it is Governor Cooper's plan that would move us fast down that track to degrading the environment. Why aren't they concerned?
Well, like any good Randian, I like seeing energy infrastructure, but if we're being honest, we're better off if we contain our energy infrastructure to the smallest footprint that we can. Let's get the most we can out of the leased land use and leave that open for other human activity and for natural space. And that's a huge issue with the wind and solar. I want to reiterate the scale. For the natural gas scenario, it was 13 square miles. For nuclear, it was 5 or 4. And for wind and solar, it was over 3,000 square miles. So we're talking about radically changing our environment, which is something that environmentalists would say they don't want to do. You know, that's what we're doing with these plans. But a whole separate issue we should really talk about, and that is discussed in depth in this report, is the environmental stress that the mining for wind and solar places on the environment. And we're not seeing that much here in the US because our environmental regulations prevent that mining, but it's taking place in other parts of the world so that we can partake in this clean energy transition.
Is that the
places
rare
like
earth minerals situation you're referring to, Jordan?
That's one element of it, but there are plenty of minerals that aren't considered rare earths that are also needed in significant supply. And just minerals generally are going to need to be developed to an unprecedented scale if we are going to undergo these sorts of transformations. And there's an excellent expose on this that was produced this spring by the International Energy Agency that goes into all of the environmental and geopolitical risks of a forced energy transition. And lest listeners think I'm pushing something that's biased toward my opinion on this, the IEA is not biased toward my preference. They want to have this transition, but they're more honest than most about the costs. And I referenced that report in our study. And I would encourage all readers to look into this and look at the effects that mining will have in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and then also in China, which is, there's kind of a complicated dynamic here. China controls a lot of the processing as well as the mining of these minerals that we would need for wind and solar and batteries. They also, they're stressing their own environment, and whether someone wants to be concerned about that or not is their choice. But there is environmental stress that's being increased as we begin to mine for more minerals. And the report refers to the mineral demand. It's not just because we need a lot of wind and solar. Wind and solar per megawatt hour requires more mineral resource than does natural gas or nuclear, ironically.
Aren't there issues with the treatment of workers as well around the world who are mining these minerals?
Yeah, absolutely. If I may jump in here, Jordan, and be less charitable than you were, the Democratic Republic of the Congo sources anywhere from 55 to 60% of the cobalt that we use. And the primary use of cobalt is in the batteries that would be needed to store the electricity generated by wind and solar. So a lot of people don't understand that the grid is not a storage device. It's not a giant bathtub that fills up with electricity during the day when it's sunny that's used later. Electricity must be consumed at the exact second that it is generated. So the amount of storage is going to be enormous. And as many as 40,000 children are digging for cobalt by hand in the Congo right now, and they're washing this ore in the river. So unfortunately, what happens is we have a lot of environmentalists, and I'm going to put the quotes around it, because really what they're doing is they like to feel good about wind, solar, and batteries in their own community. Well, they don't actually do that. They build them somewhere else. I mean, look at the Kennedys. They always say, well, we don't want the offshore wind turbines in our view shed. So we deal with this in Minnesota all the time. We've got liberal folks in the Twin Cities that want all the wind turbines in rural Minnesota, right? And also, let's talk about where the solar panels come from, right? So most of the polysilicon that's used to produce solar panels in the world comes from China, and it comes from a region in Western China that has been identified as conducting a genocide against Muslim Uyghurs. They're actually forced to work in factories. This is slavery. Even the New York Times has come out and talked about this, right? So if the New York Times is going to talk about it, I feel pretty confident moving forward, saying like, oh, hey, there are real ethical problems with this. And to boot, they use coal-fired electricity to manufacture solar panels using slavery in China, and then we buy them, we subsidize them. Every one of us has a little bit of culpability in this, not that we voted for the subsidies that we're giving to solar, but that's effectively what's happening when we do this. So we are subsidizing the use of slavery in China. and coal-fired power plants while we're, basically making our own grid more expensive and less reliable. So my whole philosophy is, why not cut out that middleman and continue to use our existing, coal, natural gas, and nuclear assets for as long as possible? But that's my soapbox.
No, I'm in complete agreement with that. And furthermore, I would just point out, I like what Donna said. There are different people in the state with different preferences when it comes to electricity policy, but we all have to go to the same provider. So that's why this becomes such a political question. We don't get to just say, we'd rather have chicken sandwich from Bojangles versus a chicken sandwich from Chick-fil-A. We're told where we have to get our chicken sandwich from when it regards electricity. But whether you like least cost, reliable electricity, or whether you prefer it from your favorite boutique provider, if you want more solar, if you want more wind, whether you are worried most about emissions or land use, there's one source currently that checks all of those boxes, and that's our existing nuclear. It's cheapest, it's the most reliable, it requires the least amount of land. So for that reason, one, I'm kind of dismayed that so few environmentalists seem to care about it. But more to the point of today is, I'm really upset with how much that was overlooked, as you mentioned in your report, Jordan, in the Clean Power Plan, in the Clean Energy Plan, and how it was put together. It's almost as if it's an afterthought, the way that it was done, and the governor's way would just look, I'm quoting from it now, new generating resources should be identified to replace the nuclear power plant's existing capacity and generation, even if the Nuclear Regulatory Commission extends their licenses for an additional 20 years. Well, there's simply no way of replacing generation from nuclear power in North Carolina or anywhere else without increasing prices, decreasing reliability, and also increasing emissions. Simply, absolutely no way of doing it.
And the interesting irony, John, of course, is that the capital city of North Carolina is Raleigh. Raleigh sits in Wake County, and in southern Wake County, there is a nuclear plant. So yes. I just find that ironic that the Clean Energy Plan would take such a negative view of nuclear when it is powering this area. Also, I thought it was fascinating that Jordan used the phrase forced energy transition. And John, that makes me think instantly of here in North Carolina, I believe it was Senate Bill 3 was the number on it. Tell us about the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard and why it is in law, and what it is in law that requires us to have this conversation about sources that are not the least cost possible.
So yeah, in 2007, we passed the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standards in law, and it laid out a menu over a long period of time of set years of targets that the utilities, including the smaller municipals and electric co-ops, would have to meet. Although the requirements weren't quite as stringent as they are on Duke and Dominion, but it would require them to start uploading more and more solar and wind and some of the other, like hog waste, chicken waste, converted into gas, basically. And you can track the beginning of that to North Carolina electricity prices going up relative to the state and the region. Our electricity rates have always been lower than the nation and in the region. So as Jordan pointed that out, we're still looking relatively well in those comparisons, but not near as well as we used to look. But other factors are at play, including North Carolina's very generous to solar interpretation of federal PURPA law, which is the Public Utilities Regulatory Policies Act. It's something from 1978. It would be a whole nother, in fact, we have made a presentation out of this.
Pretty complex.
Yeah, but one of the things that it requires basically is if you're a qualifying facility as of solar, then the utility is required to buy any of your power that's generated at any time that it's generated, regardless of need. In North Carolina, because of the way that we've done it, we have 60% of the qualifying facilities in the nation. That's how, and then on top of that, we give them extremely generous contracts that last for a long time. It used to be up to 15 years. After a reform a few years ago, they knocked it down to 10. But if you've heard about in the media, well, costs of providing solar have been declining. Well, they have. But when the utility is locked into a purchase of power agreement for 10 years, based on how the expense was at the beginning, the ratepayers, the consumers are not, we're not benefiting from those lower costs of generation. The solar companies are, and the utility, it doesn't matter to them because they're going to pass the cost through. So that's another reason.
It's worth pointing out that the declines in solar cost have coincided with the growth of that industry in Xinjiang, as Isaac mentioned. Is that a coincidence? It probably isn't.
It probably isn't. So, but I'm just looking at it from our perspective. So yeah.
You know, gentlemen, it's interesting because again, I talked to people that I consider to be free market conservatives who say, look, you know, I have nothing against renewable energy sources. I'm all for innovation and moving forward. If we can find things that are more efficient, more reliable, more innovative, why not? Let's all move forward. But they say if the sources can't support themselves in the marketplace, if they can't compete and aren't viable without a government subsidy or a ratepayer subsidy, then why are we doing this? It's a real head scratcher.
Yeah, well, and go ahead, Jordan.
Okay, well, electricity in general is a real head scratcher. This field does not operate on normal market dynamics of supply, demand, and pricing. So it's very difficult to ascertain that. The same criticism could be made of nuclear, unfortunately, because it arose in the context of government control of the industry and in the context of the monopoly utility model. So there's always going to be this challenge of even knowing whether something could pass a market test. I think we should try to introduce as many market mechanisms as possible to try to get to those answers.
What about the storage issue, Jordan, on that? Because again, that requires federal action, does it not? I mean, Yucca Mountain, we've heard about it for what, a couple of decades here in Nevada?
We face some significant barriers to growth in nuclear, and those questions will arise with this report, no doubt. And there's also the unfortunate example just south of you guys down in Georgia of Plant Vogtle. And that's why we focused on the expansion of the Korean reactor in the UAE, because it shows that this actually can be done if we remove some of the regulatory barriers, and that's going to be necessary. That the plant in the UAE, if you compare it on a cost per megawatt basis to Plant Vogtle, the expansion going on in Georgia, it's less than half the cost. If I recall correctly, the plant in the UAE is coming in at a cost of about $5.5 billion per gigawatt. And I believe the Plant Vogtle is at about 12 billion per gigawatt.
Let's talk a little bit more about natural gas, if we could, because we have had an experience, unfortunately, with natural gas and not being able to build a pipeline here in North Carolina. And Jordan, I believe I've got it right, that you've got nuclear number one, you've got natural gas number two, and so in order to expand natural gas here, our use of natural gas, wouldn't we need another pipeline?
It certainly seems that way, and I know the state's run into some significant challenges, which John is probably much more well-versed on, so I'll turn it over to him to answer this one.
Well, essentially, we have the Cooper administration putting the brakes on any expansion of pipelines, whether it was the recent the one they wanted to bring from
Atlantic Coast pipeline, I believe.
Yeah, the Atlantic Coast pipeline, And there was some funny business going on with the administration back then, where they essentially forced the utilities to bring in more solar than originally they had planned to, kind of coerced into thinking that it would help them to get the pipeline, and then the Department of Environmental Quality put the kibosh on the pipeline, and then recently we've seen it again with the other pipeline.
Now, what we need to remember here and emphasize as we advocate for affordability and reliability is that wind and solar are going to run into the exact same challenges. And we're seeing this across the country with political resistance to the building of new infrastructure. There's a paper that as Isaac, I don't know if you participated in it, but Robert Bryce produced with American Experiment, which talks about the challenges to new wind and solar infrastructure. There's another paper that I refer to in our report here by Princeton University's Net Zero project, which looks into how much land is going to be required for new wind and solar transmission lines, because again, this is really widely dispersed and the numbers are just astronomical. And I would direct readers to check out the links to that Princeton report and to Robert Bryce's.
You know,
Yeah,
Jordan,
absolutely.
go ahead,
And-
Isaac.
Yeah, and one last thing I'd like to talk about when it comes to natural gas versus nuclear. Obviously, the price of natural gas is going to be lower than a new nuclear power plant, but you're not getting the same reliability value as they learned in Texas. So the thing about a nuclear plant or a coal plant is you've got weeks or months of fuel sitting around on site, right? So even if the railroads got shut down for some reason, there would be coal there to burn. There would be uranium there left to, generate electricity. But with natural gas, that's not the case. The pumping station, they have these big compressor stations and they push the gas through these pipelines. If that compressor station goes down, there is no fuel for that power plant to produce electricity. So we are basically making the entire electricity system more fragile and prone to things like a Colonial Pipeline shutdown by putting all of our eggs in a natural gas basket. So that's why I think it's even less responsible to go on a grid that is, either primarily fueled by natural gas or de facto fueled by natural gas. So what happens with the wind and solar grid is it actually becomes a wind, solar, and natural gas grid. It's actually just a natural gas grid with hood ornaments that look like wind turbines and solar power on the top, because you have to have enough natural gas plants available to produce electricity when wind is producing zero power, or at nighttime when solar is producing zero power. So ultimately what happens in a grid like that is natural gas becomes the most important aspect of that supply chain, regardless of whether you think that you're going to be producing more electricity with wind and solar. So that is also a reliability risk that is becoming much more obvious in the wake of the Texas blackouts.
And folks, I want to point out one thing to our viewers as well. We're talking about the issue of natural gas pipelines, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. You can find in the comment section of our Facebook page here at the Locke Foundation a link to a Carolina Journal story about Governor Cooper's involvement with stopping the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. You'll find that link right there. That'll get you back up to speed, remind you of exactly the role the governor played in that. This reliability issue really is so vital here. I mean, gentlemen, I'm not sure if you were all affected, but a month or two ago, those of us here in North Carolina were immensely affected by the Colonial Pipeline shutdown. Of course, that was bringing in auto fuel. And for the first time in decades, I actually had to sit in a gas line in order to get gas. And there's all sorts of dynamics about that, people overreacting to the potential shortage, et cetera. But I think it really brought home to people, hey, this is very real, energy issues and what happens when there is some sort of a cut in the supply, whether it is a man-made or nature-made emergency that is at play. And that's why I look at Texas and California, and I've had a number of people say to me, hey, are you guys going to talk about this today? Could Texas or California, meaning brownouts or blackouts, actually occur here in North Carolina? Are the dynamics here setting up for that, or are those two completely different issues?
My argument in the paper is that the better comparison is to California because of the potential retirement of the tremendous nuclear capacity that North Carolina has. Texas is a bit of a different scenario, and they have some funky actual market implementation there that North Carolina doesn't have. So the best comparison would be to what Californians like myself have to think about on a daily basis. The difference is when you live on the coast of California, whether I have AC or not doesn't really matter a whole lot. It matters if you're in Raleigh.
Exactly. Lucky you, by the way, on that. But, you know, I have family in Southern California and they've been through brownouts, you know, and it's unfortunately at times just becomes a way of life. And that I think is foreign to us here in North Carolina, which is why it was, I think, stunning to so many people what happened with the Colonial Pipeline shutdown and their inability at times to have enough gas to actually get in their car and go somewhere.
Yeah. May it ever be foreign to North Carolina. And I agree that the risk especially is in shutting down some of the nuclear capacity we have in North Carolina, because these brownouts, these situations don't happen when it's pleasant outside. You know, it's not going to be a 70-degree day and everybody wants to be outside. It's going to be when we're in a temperature extreme, either really too cold or too hot, which means that people's lives are going to be at risk. There was an NBER, a National Bureau of Economic Research paper looking at what happened in Japan after the nuclear accident, the Fukushima Daiichi accident, and Japan's overreaction. I mean, they shut down all of their nuclear plants, not just and they had 54, not just the few nuclear plants that were situated sort of like Fukushima. And as a North Carolinian, what was interesting about that to me is the amount of generation Japan got from nuclear is very similar to North Carolina's. They got 30%. In North Carolina, we get 32%. So they got rid of all of their nuclear. Their electricity rates went up a third within a couple of years. But more so than that, what these economists studying it found out that more people died as a result of that, of those price increases owing to the shutdown of nuclear, than actually died regarding the accident because of the nuclear accident. That just shows how important it is, keeping the prices low, keeping reliability, keeping nuclear.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and the deaths associated with Fukushima were not actually from Fukushima. That was from the tidal wave, right? So what a lot of people don't understand is that one person died as a result of the meltdown at the nuclear plant, and that was a worker. Not a single civilian or person outside of the plant died as a result of the meltdown at the plant. There was a giant earthquake in the ocean that created a large tsunami, and that is what, you know, caused people to pass away, unfortunately. So nuclear is the safest form of energy that we have as a group of people. It's the best thing we've ever invented. And until we've cracked fusion, it's going to be the best thing that we have. So it's really the ultimate compromise solution for people that want reliable, affordable electricity to be their main priority. And also for those who want, you know, emissions free to be their main thing. We should all be able to come together on nuclear. And the fact that we can't is really just tragic.
And something that I should have put even more emphasis on in this report is that North Carolina has the potential to extend the lifespan of its existing nuclear fleet. They're eligible for that. And the Clean Energy Plan, as John noted, doesn't want to do it. It wants to take these off of the grid, which would really be a tragedy. And you've got these two sides to it. There's the imminent risk of blackouts, brownouts, and people perishing because of exposure to extreme temperatures, particularly in the winter. But then there's also just the over time loss of potential economic gains from energy prices being just a little bit higher every day, and all the foregone, whether innovations, inventions, things that having low energy cost inputs would facilitate. There's another tragedy there.
So moving forward, what should our General Assembly do if lawmakers, and some of them are watching us right now, or they will see the video of this presentation and take a look at this report, Jordan, what should they do?
Once again, the North Carolina expert here is John. What do you think?
Well, I think, first of all, that we absolutely need to prioritize keeping our nuclear power plants, getting them relicensed, and that's something that the John Locke Foundation has been actively promoting in our policy positions for the past few years. Our number one recommendation is study how to promote the retention of existing zero emissions nuclear plants. Because their levelized cost of energy is by far the lowest of any of the other source. And as I pointed out earlier, losing them would lead to higher emissions and much more expensive electricity. You simply cannot replace nuclear and not make our electricity generation less reliable. And I said it backwards, but you know, I'm trying. If you replace it, it's going to be less reliable. It's going to be more expensive, and it's going to end up with more emissions. Even if you replaced it with just solar and wind, because they will need to be backed up by most likely natural gas. I don't think they would back them up with coal, but it would be a fossil fuel source, and it would be emitting. And because if they use it the way that they're doing it right now, which is turning them off, and then turning off the plants and then turning them back on when they're needed, that's a very inefficient way of using those plants. It's something that even Duke Energy has admitted to. We got a hold of an application form from Duke to the Division of Air Quality, where they asked for the ability to keep their backup natural gas plant at a low cycling threshold, so that but they needed to be allowed extra emissions from so doing, because not doing it that way, but only being able to turn it on when it's needed and turning it back off when solar is coming back online, is ending up with much greater emissions. And we're talking about a level of like 3 times as many emissions doing it the way we're currently doing it than the way Duke asked to do it, which would have been 44% more than they were allowed. Anyway, so definitely policymakers need to ensure that our nuclear power keeps going, and I would love to see them question some of the assumptions going into Governor Cooper's plan.
And the perfect way to do it, an ideal way, is for folks to take a look at this report that we've been talking about today. It's called Energy Crossroads. Jordan McGillis is the author of that. He's been one of our guests today. A reminder that this report you can find at johnlocke.org. Also, there is a link to it in the comment section of our Facebook page here at the John Locke Foundation. Isaac Orr is with the Center of the American Experiment. John Sanders is my colleague here at the John Locke Foundation. And Jordan McGillis is with the Institute for Energy Research. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your analysis and perspective here on a vital issue to every North Carolinian. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna.
And folks, we want to thank you once again for joining us. We are just so psyched that you join us every Monday here to talk about the issues that are critical to the future of North Carolina. As you know, here at the Locke Foundation, our mission is to make sure that we move forward on solid footing, that our policymakers have the facts and the analysis that they need to compare and contrast the policy choices that they're going to be making, since more than 10 million people will be affected by those very decisions that they make. We are committed here to making sure that they have the information they need, and that they understand that freedom and liberty are at stake here, and that they understand the implications on freedom and liberty of those decisions that they're making. That is our mission. We would really appreciate it if you would consider making a tax-deductible donation to our work here, to Forward Freedom here in North Carolina. If you'd like to do that, we would be so thankful, and it's very quick and easy. Just go to johnlocke.org. In the upper right-hand corner of the website there is the Donate tab. Just click on that. Takes you less than 2 minutes. It's safe, fast, secure, and we would greatly appreciate your help in fueling our work. I want to thank our panel today, and again, a reminder, check out the report and the executive summary at johnlocke.org. I want you to have a great week, and join us again next Monday for another edition of Shaftesbury Society. On behalf of the entire John Locke Foundation team, I'm Donna Martinez. Have a great week, everybody.